I'm going to make a spring exactly identical to this one by using the lathe. Now first we need to find some stock for the spring, and this is the kind of stuff we need. It's sold at hobby stores mostly, and it will be usually called music wire, but it may be under the name piano wire or spring steel. Now the reason we need this is because it's already been tempered to the right hardness and springiness, so we can make springs of a large range of sizes with this stock without having to worry about doing any tricky heat treatment processes. So for our tools, we're going to need a bar that we're going to wind the spring around. Now the spring will uncoil a little bit, so your spring's going to end up very slightly larger in diameter than what you wind it on. And I have some holes drilled in where I can catch the steel onto when I go to wind it. The other thing we need is, with any scrap bit of metal in a tool post, some holes that we can use to feed the wire through onto the bar as we wind it around on the lathe. We have our spindle where we put our workpiece, and at the back of the spindle it can be connected directly to this set of gears called the change gears. Now these gears are part of a set that you as the user can take out and change to make a whole series of different ratios. Now between the spindle and the change gears there's a lever, so we can either have them disengaged or set in a forward or reverse direction. Now when we do have it engaged in one of the directions, the gears will spin and connect here to the lead screw, which is along the bottom connected to the carriage. Now I've got a metric machine, so my screw has a pitch of 1.5 millimeters. So when it's engaged, that means for every revolution of the spindle I should expect the carriage to progress 1.5 millimeters times whatever total gear ratio I've set up. So you likely have some kind of table like this which gives you some gear settings for getting different thread pitches. But this only goes up to 2 millimeters. I want to make a spring that's got a pitch of 5 millimeters, so I'm going to have to figure out my own gear ratios. Now just as a general rule, when you're making a spring, you can make the pitch up to about 4 or 5 times whatever the width of your wire is. If you want to make a spring that's got a much wider pitch than that, it's going to uncoil too much, and you're not going to be able to do it without some more complicated heat treating processes. But I want to avoid doing heat treating here. So there's two ways you can configure your gears in your change gear system. So the simplest is just 3 gears in a line, and your final pitch will be the ratio of the first to the final gear multiplied by your lead screw distance. Now gear B in the middle, that's just there to fill space. It doesn't matter how many teeth are on that gear, you just put in whatever will fill the gap. Then the other way is to use 4 gears in this chain configuration like this, and in this case you multiply the first ratio A to B by the second gear ratio C to D, then by your lead screw to get your final pitch. So to achieve my final pitch of 6 millimeters, I need to make my gear ratio, either A to D or this combined sum, equal to 4. So I have a table here of all the gears that I have in my box, and I can see immediately that ideally if I put an 80 tooth gear and a 20 tooth gear, I could just make a 3 gear system that gets me a ratio of 4 straight away. The only problem is this is the 80 tooth gear and this is the 20, and if you try to put it in, you find it doesn't actually physically fit in, and even if it does, it will jam up pretty quickly. So unfortunately I'm going to have to cross that off my table. I've also found that, okay, this is too big. Some of these big ones, this is kind of pushing it. So what I'm going to have to do is use a 4-gear system where I multiply two values together. So quite simply, 2 times 2 equals 4. So I might take, say, this ratio and that ratio there. So by setting up these 4 gears, which will just fit in the machine, I'll get the right gear ratio to get my 6mm pitch. So here is that gear setup. It's kind of pushing the limits of what the motor can take. So if you've got a 2-speed gearbox on your spindle, you'll have to set it to low speed, high torque mode. And then when you engage it in either the forward or the reverse, it should work fine. You only want to go very slow. If you are using a thicker steel that takes a bit more force, you might want to just forget about the motor and just rotate it by hand, because you can get a lot stronger power that way. Now I want to figure out how long to make my spring. So the only requirement I have for this purpose is that I want the difference between the free spring and the compressed spring to be 70mm of distance. So I'm making my coils at a pitch of 6mm apart, and the wire I'm using is 1.5mm thick, so that leaves a total leftover space of 4.5mm in each coil for the amount of compression. So calculating the free space, so I figure out that to get the amount of compressed space that I want, I need roughly 15.5 coils in my spring. So with a pitch spacing of 6mm per coil, I've got to make my spring roughly about 93mm of working space. So we'll take our wire and thread it through an appropriate sized hole in our tool post. And what we want to do is bend it so it will catch into our rod. So I'll make one bend which is going to go through the hole, and I'll make a second bend which will give us a bit of clearance away, so we can put it through there, and we'll start winding the spring from here. So this bit of extra length will give us room to either like reform it or cut it off, depending on how we want our spring to look at the end. So I'll get my spring in here, tool holder in place, and I'll bring it up so there's just enough room to allow the steel to wind. And I want to set my holder so it's just a little bit below the top. So I'll lock that in place. Now I've got the carriage unlocked. I just want to do a few turns to make a little start bit on the spring. So I'll wind that 2 or 3 times. Let it come back. Then I'll mark the length that I measured out before, 93mm. So that'll be my whole working distance of the spring. Now with the speed turned all the way off to 0 to begin with, I'll lock the carriage, set the direction, and slowly just start ramping the speed up. Very slowly. I'm only going at like 40 RPM at the moment. Alright, I'm approaching the end. Now I'll just stop here and show you. If you were using a much thicker steel, or if you hadn't like really lubed everything up much, your motor might jam. But if that happens, you can still just do it by hand. I'm going to do the last little bit by hand. Show how easy it is. Alright, I've hit my mark. Now I'm going to unlock the carriage so it doesn't slide anymore. Then make a few little winds back so we can see the end of the spring. And then when I unlock the chuck, the spring's going to uncoil a little bit. So you had your glasses on from the start, probably, but I'll put them on now just in case. So I'll just gently keep a hold of it. There we go, it's uncoiled a bit. And there's a spring, so you can see it's about 3 or 4 millimeters larger in diameter than the actual rod we threaded it on. Alright, so you should be able to easily just pry the end out of the hole, get your spring off, and then the ends you can trim off with something like a Dremel or a grinder. And you can file or sand that off to get a nice smooth finish. With a few simple hardware items, it's fairly easy to make an estimate of how strong our spring is. So what I'll start with is a bolt that's long enough for the measurement. I'll put a washer on it, then take our spring and sit it in our test holding rig here. So first I'll just measure what the unloaded length of the spring is, and that's 9 centimeters. So what I'm going to do is load it with 5 kilos of weight, and that's going to be just pushed down by gravity. So 5 kilos times the gravitation constant, 9.8, gives us a total force of 49 newtons we're going to apply to the spring. So I have 2 washers connected by a piece of string, which I will wrap around the weight here. And I'll put it on the bolt and secure it with a nut and let it fall freely. Now, as long as we're not bottoming out the spring completely, this should give us a reasonable measurement of the strength. So now the spring has dropped to a height of 4.4 centimeters. So that's a total change of 4.6 centimeters. And we can calculate from that our spring has a strength of 10.6 newtons per centimeter. And I can keep that recorded somewhere, so I know for any spring I make with this diameter, this size wire and this pitch, it should come out roughly the same. This different spring, which has the same pitch and diameter, but it's made from 2mm wire instead of 1.5. So we're going to see how much stronger that will make the spring in the end. So we start out with the length 8.2 centimeters. And I'll put on the 5 kilo weight to start with. And it didn't really deflect that much. It's only down to about 7 centimeters. So it won't give us an accurate enough measurement for the crudeness of the experiment. So what I'm going to do is add on an additional 5 kilos for a total 98 newtons of force. And now, with some settling, it's gone down to 5.8 centimeters. So that's a total deflection of 2.4 centimeters. And measuring that up, that gives us a total spring constant of around 40.8 newtons per centimeter. So this spring is about 4 times as strong as its thinner counterpart.